Welcome to the Legendary Upside podcast. My name is Pat Crane. You can find all of my content at legendaryupside.com. Some of that content by Daniel Racz, who's joining me today to talk through his new article on the site, going through the Rookies and Sophomore tournament that is about to launch on Underdog. Daniel, how's it going?
It's going good. Anytime you can write 3,500 words about the nichest tournament that hasn't even dropped yet, you just simply have to be the first to market.
It's over 3,500. I was just in there. It's like 37 and change. So yeah, it's a nice read though. It's very kind of smooth in terms of its transition from topic to topic. You cover a lot in this article, and we'll kind of just go through here and discuss some of the insights you have on this tournament. If people are not familiar, or you kind of dabbled last year in the Rookies and Sophomores tournament and you kind of need a quick refresher, what are like the very basic rules, roster size, all that with this tournament?
Yeah, so assuming it's the same as last year, which we have no indication to assume differently, you'll be in 4-person draft rooms. You'll each have 12 picks. You have to start 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 2 wide receivers or tight ends. They are in 1 group, and then 1 flex, which is your next high scoring running back or wideout. And then the advancement structure last year was the first of your 4-person regular season pod, 2 out of 10 in week 15, 1 out of 10 in week 16, and then only a 56-person final, if I'm remembering correctly, so far smaller.
Okay, so some pretty big, massive differences from typical best ball. It's almost more similar to playoff best ball in a way. Was that fair to say?
Yeah, I think the rooms are sadly sharper than playoff best ball, where the correlation
it's not very correlation based. So in that way, it's not like playoff best ball at all. There's not much correlation to be had. But yeah, they're quick drafts like playoff best ball.
Yeah, you can probably do one in 10 to 15 minutes reliably. The correlation element of playoff best ball that the field completely fails to understand year over year is absent because there's little to no correlation. There are very few players that even play for the same team. But it's another really niche tournament where I think there are still edges to be had from a game theory based instead of just rankings or projections, which makes it more fun.
For sure. So before we dive into a little bit more of the strategy elements of this tournament, I guess what's interesting, one thing that's always interesting about rookies and sophomores is the player pool, because obviously the player pool matters no matter what type of best ball you're doing. But in here, the player pool is so constricted. It's just rookies and sophomores. So how, which players are rookies and sophomores, has an incredible impact on what we're going to be doing in these drafts. You can have a really, really strong running back group or a really weak running back group, or this year, I would say a few elites and not much depth defines this year's running back room. You have varying degrees of quarterback strength. This year's pretty interesting because it's not the super strongest sophomore group, but it's a pretty good rookie group. But rookies come with a little bit more risk. We don't know how good they are yet. We thought Bryce Young might be pretty good and had a really bad rookie season, so we don't know. But there is upside there as well. Maybe those guys are getting undervalued because we haven't seen them yet. At wide receiver, it seems pretty deep this year, and in general, because of the way the NFL works, and tight ends and wide receivers being in one group, that's probably your safest bet to have depth. But I think maybe more than usual, we've got elite options, depth options, wide receiver / tight end looks pretty strong. Is that general assessment fit with what you're thinking?
Yeah, and in past years, again, there have only been 2 previous years, so we don't have too much historical backing for this, but Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave were pretty early picks as sophomores this year, and they were pretty different from the rookies. Last year, the JSN, Jordan Addison, Zay, QJ class, none were seen as these huge, have to have it guys. Marvin Harrison's probably going to be the second receiver off the board and would be the first if we didn't see the greatest rookie season ever from Puka Nacua, which is just incredible thing to hear, almost impossible. And then you see Malik Neighbors and Rome Odunze also going to be very highly drafted. And there's tremendous depth at wide receiver. So again, we can only conjecture about how ADP will shake up at this point because the tournament should drop in the next day or two. But there's going to be plenty of depth at wide receiver.
Yeah, you did some tiers in the article, and these tiers are not. I wouldn't get too hung up if you're watching this on the players that Daniel has put in each tier. That's not really the point of this. The point is to underline how deep wide receiver and tight end is likely to be in this tournament. He listed out early receivers who project strongly: Puka Nacua, Marvin Harrison Jr., Rashee Rice, and Tank Dell. Strong rookie profiles and breakout options: Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, Zay Flowers, Brian Thomas, Sam Laporta, Jaden Reed. Wide receivers who could break out and produce usable weeks with occasional spike weeks, but at lower frequencies: Jordan Addison, JSN, Dalton Kincaid, Brock Bowers, Josh Downs. Rookies and sophomores that should have little competition for routes: A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, Keon Coleman, Lad McConkey, Marvin Mims, Demario Douglas, Michael Wilson, Roman Wilson, Xavier Legette, Ricky Pearsall, and then true dart throws. We've got a bunch more of those. So, yeah, I mean, you could argue that Xavier Worthy should be in the breakout group or whatever. But, like, the point is that there's a lot of guys in each group. And when you go to running back, it's really, what, 2 or 3 guys that are elites, and then there's a pretty big drop-off, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, Bijan, Gibbs, and Devon Chan all have top 24 ADPs in the big board. They're 3 of our top running backs in rankings. So I think all 3 are good, but then no one else until around ADP of 105 with Chase Brown. Tyjae Spears is around there as well. Zach Charbonnet, some of the intriguing rookies who are probably going round 3 or 4 will be around there, but there is no running back middle class in this tournament. So seeing how the market reacts to a true stars and scrubs player pool at between 1 to 2 of your 5 starting spots is going to be fun to watch and possibly something that sharper drafters can exploit.
I don't think this would be what you would do, but just go with me for the sake of argument here. Let's say you're at the 101 and you take Puka. Then it goes, Bijan, Achan, and Gibbs are all off the board, well before you pick again at the 3-4 turn. What is your plan at running back if you get locked out of those 3 guys in a situation like that?
To beat them everywhere else, ideally. So you want to make sure you're strong at quarterback, have enough running backs for one of them at least to break out from that lower class into the middle or even high class. And again, this all takes place before the draft, so we don't have landing spots for any of the rookies. And that's part of the reason I try and take a balanced portfolio approach, because I think the edges to this tournament are more structural than player takey. But if you think, Jonathan Brooks is a near lock to go in the top 75 and you think you have a good evidence-based reason for that, no harm in pushing an overweight position. But I would caution against a super strong overweight position on any of these running backs or wide receivers.
Do you feel like there's potential to get locked out at running back? Like if you don't get those top 3 guys, are you trying to take like a Chase Brown or a Tyjae Spears as you're at the 301, or are you like, no, I'm pushing this?
I'd be pushing it with other drafters already having enough running back. They are then, again, assuming some modicum of rationality, less likely to take running backs because they're relatively strong compared to at least one team. If any of the teams have 2 of the 3 elite running backs, they're probably done or tapping one towards the very end of the draft. So you are then incentivized to not necessarily reach because your opponent has no real incentive, has less of an incentive to take those running backs. So I'd be trying to push it as long as possible, especially with that lower class tier with Tyjae and all of those. A lot of them project pretty similarly. So I would just want ideally 3 of that group, maybe 2, and then some dart throws after, and hope that I have enough running back points and that the QBs and pass catchers can carry my teams through.
Let's say like Blake Corum's your RB1. Are you going like you're going to take like 4 running backs in that type of build instead of 3? Is that the idea?
Yeah. I mean, if I had a running back room with Blake Corum, Tyjae Spears, and anyone else going around there, Chase Brown, that seems fine given how the tournament's playing out with such a drop off after the first 3. But if it's Blake Corum, Jalen Wright, Zach Charbonnet, and then Roshan Johnson or Izzy Abanikanda, you probably do want to have 4 there because points every week matter with how small it is. You only have 5 starting spots, so taking near zeros is far more penal.
That makes sense. Okay. So, I mentioned running back because that's one spot where you can get locked out, or at least it's just so stars and scrubs that it's worth talking through that. But then there's lots of dart throw guys where I don't think you're going to feel like I literally don't have any running backs. Quarterback is pretty interesting because you're not going to get locked out, I don't think, at quarterback because there's, it's a deep quarterback class coming in. You can at least take a Michael Penix or something and hope you get some starts later in the season. But there's certainly going to be some pretty big differences between the strongest teams here at quarterback in this tournament and the weakest teams. There's, you could have CJ Stroud and, Drake May versus, Bryce Young and, Bo Nix.
Yeah, I would want to make sure that most of my portfolio is relatively strong at quarterback, and you can only decide relative strength through looking at how, after 5 to 10 drafts, seeing, okay, here's how the quarterback rooms shape up across every team in every room. I want to be more often on the strong side, and I want quarterbacks that I can project to start a lot of games because injuries will happen. Getting through the regular season is pretty important, but then also having multiple viable quarterbacks in the money weeks. I talk about it pretty early in the article. Part of the reason that my team won this tournament in the 2022-2023 season, the same year Pat won, was because I had Justin Fields, who did very well during the regular season, had a horrific week 16, around 10 points, and was the only Fields team to get through to week 17 because I had Kenny Pickett produce enough points in week 16 to propel it through. So having another quarterback gives you a path to leverage in a small final.
Yeah, we buried the lead here. You won this tournament 2 years ago, so you know
Yes.
what you're talking about here. Let me ask you on, at the 1-2 turn, you could, I think the way ADP is going to shake out, pretty consistently double tap Stroud and Richardson. Is that too strong at quarterback?
I wouldn't have zero that in my portfolio. I would guess around the 1-2 turn, like the 3 and 4 or the 5 and 6. But those 2 players, I think Stroud and Richardson will generally be off the board after the 2-2. I would say that almost every time I had one of the final 2 picks in the first round, I would leave that pocket with one of the quarterbacks. If I had the 3rd pick,
wait, so let me just on it. So you're saying if you are drafting a 3-hole to 4-hole, your plan is to have Stroud or Richardson,
yes.
Stroud or Richardson a very high percentage of the time.
Yes, I would try not. If I had the 4th pick and the 5th, I would almost certainly take one of them. If I had the 3rd pick, I'd probably want to push it to 6 just to see what the 4-5 does because they project similarly enough that I don't want to take the stand before I have to. And if the 4-5 doesn't take either quarterback, then great, I'll take one. Hope quarterbacks continue to fall. But if Stroud and Richardson and I'm going earlier in round 1, which I think is unlikely with how strong the Bijan, Gibbs, Puka.
Yeah, I just think the running backs, you almost have to assume that Bijan and Gibbs go ahead of Stroud and Richardson.
Yeah.
Just given the drop off.
Yeah, and probably Puka as well. So that would be my guess at ADP as well with Stroud and Richardson at around 4 and 5. But I would suspect that not that often do you see someone double tapping. I wouldn't want to double tap that much unless all the other quarterbacks are going to be gone before my next 2 picks. And by all the quarterbacks, let's say the cutoff would be Young, Levis, McCarthy, the guys that are reasonably likely to start the most of the games this year, especially the money weeks. Because if you take Stroud and Richardson, you're kind of locking yourself out because taking a 3rd quarterback early really puts you behind the 8 ball at running back and pass catcher.
So why does it lock you? It locks you out of a QB3 build, is what you're saying?
If with how shallow the quarterback pool is after McCarthy, you can take Bo Nix, Michael Penix, Nix is more likely to give you production this year. I think Penix is a dog. I'm pretty confident he goes on day 2 of the draft, not buying any round 1 smoke. Also not caring to draft Aiden O'Connell, because even if he's throwing for 200 yards and 1 touchdown every other game, that's like a ceiling
Hey,
outcome.
he plays the Chargers twice. I don't know. I don't know if Harbaugh's going to have that
So,
defense whipped into shape
just
in a year or not.
if you were to do the 2 for 2 and look at your teams after the fact with Richardson as your QB2 versus allowing the chaos of the draft to keep unfolding, like, the moment you take Stroud and Richardson, you then have to signal to the other people, I'm not taking a QB the next 2 picks, because if you were to go Stroud, Richardson, then any of the Levis, Bryce, McCarthy, I think that's an embarrassment of riches. There will be other teams that have built similar quarterback rooms without sinking that draft capital. And you do want some of the high-end talent probably at receiver in that range, because the top 3 running backs are going to go off the board, and I'm not sure when RB4 goes. But I would be careful to eliminate any plausible paths early in the draft, and taking Stroud and Richardson together, I think, cuts off avenues to getting a falling younger Levis, at least often.
That makes sense. I think the dream scenario would be that they both come back if you're at the 101. That's when I would greedily double tap those guys, because it's like, well, I've already got Bijan probably, and so now I'm taking those 2 quarterbacks. I doubt that like happens, but if it did, I think I would fire that.
But I think if you're the Bijan team, there will be a non-zero amount of drafts where you get one of those 2, and then you can consider Caleb or Daniels next, or you can wait maybe a May falls, but Young and Levis as well and McCarthy are nice options. So I think there are a lot of ways to play quarterback. I don't want to prematurely say I'm done at quarterback, but I also want to manage that with making sure I'm generally stronger at quarterback than the field.
Now, if we had, let's say it's a Bijan Robinson and Richardson comes all the way back, and then later we add Will Levis, that would, in a 12-team best ball league, we'd be done at quarterback probably. But in this tournament, it sounds like you would still be willing to tack on like a JJ McCarthy. Why would you be willing to build out like a 3 quarterback build in this tournament with smaller starting rosters, where you might be done at 2 in the big board?
With 1 of 4 advancing round 1, 2 of 10, then 1 of 10, there's going to be a lot of concentration of quarterbacks. The year Fields was strong in the regular season, Trey Lance, I'd assume almost none of his teams made it through. Trevor Lawrence had a fine, bordering on good year, but it's going to be so concentrated on 1 to 2 quarterbacks, I would guess. Maybe not if we have enough strong players from this class, but if it gets concentrated enough, having the leverage off of the had to have it quarterback, if they're the one to have a bad week in week 17 with 60 to 80% of the field having them, is, I think, a nice path to differentiation.
It's also that the quarterback just makes up a bigger portion of the scoring in this tournament, right?
Yeah. Instead of an 8 or 9 person in Best Ball Mania and the other 12-team leagues, it's now a 5-person tournament, or 5-person scoring lineup in the tournament. So 20% of your lineup comes to quarterback points. Quarterbacks also get hurt. Justin Fields missed games the year I won, though I didn't have to deal with that in the playoffs, but Fields had a bad week and Kenny Pickett came through. So if you do have your star quarterback miss a week, having at least one more avenue to scoring enough points to getting you through is, I think, a valuable contingency.
Yeah, so it's 2 things. Quarterbacks are worth more because they literally make up a bigger part of the lineup. And then 2, you want to get leverage in the tournament. Daniel, when he won, he goes through, like, there's a 56-team final, and a big part of this, because the field is so small, even more so than in Best Ball Mania, the big board, those types of tournaments, it's going to get really concentrated. The final size, it has to. There's less players who score points, and it's going to be like some of them don't score like any points at all, and a lot of the success of the teams that are making the final is going to be driven by a small group of players, and those groups are going to be that group of players are going to be highly represented in the final. So you want to show up in any way, you want to pull all the levers, right? Because you want to show up with the under-owned guys, and you were actually able to do that when you won. This is a screenshot of your team. You had Justin Fields, who had a disappointing week before that, and so you actually showed up with low-owned Justin Fields. And then who was your other low-owned guy here?
Najee Harris. This
Najee Harris.
photo was taken before the game, but Najee had 19 fantasy points. And because Najee was so underwhelming as a first-round pick that year, very few Najee teams made it to the playoffs. A lot of Fields teams were able to make it to the playoffs, but fell in week 16. So if my memory is correct and only my team of the 56 had Fields, that's less than 2% ownership. Najee was similarly low due to his disappointing year. So I knew that the path to winning was just the guy that no one else has does well, and then the guy that very few people have does well, and the rest won't matter that much. And Kadarius Toney's 7.1 points still counted for my lineup, and it was enough. Kadarius also fumbled in that game before getting benched. He probably would have got like 15 points without the fumble.
So you won this tournament with Najee Harris and Kadarius Toney in a game he got benched.
Yeah, it's a real heel turn.
Yeah, I mean, like this is kind of how you do it. You show up with guys who are underowned, which is difficult. We can't pick ahead of time. Obviously we would do that. But do you remember if you drafted Willis ahead of Pickett? I can't remember which order they would have gone in.
I would assume I did draft Willis ahead of Pickett because there was a lot of Malik Willis is going first round. I thought he was live to go too.
Right. This is before the draft.
Yeah, there was always the Steelers connection. I'd like to think the reason I had drafted Pickett, Najee, and Freiermuth was the team level correlation, just like knowing coin flip chance Pickett's in Pittsburgh, and then you have 3 players on one offense.
Right.
Can't guarantee what I was thinking 2 years ago, probably drafting during a lecture.
Hey man, you gotta just say it was that. You can't admit you don't know.
Yeah, the Fields and Khalil Herbert probably did that. Bears have a good game because both of them were not rookies, so you didn't have the draft worry.
Right. That was built-in correlation very clearly. But I mean, one thing, right? Even if maybe it wasn't Pickett, maybe you thought Willis had a chance to go to the Steelers. I mean, the Steelers looked like they were drafting a quarterback. So what I think maybe the sharpest way to have played it would have been draft some Steelers and then get 2 other rookies who are likely to go there. Let's hope one goes there. But I mean, if Pickett was in fact the 3rd quarterback that you selected on this team,
I believe he was.
That decision won you the tournament because you don't get into the final without him covering Justin Fields' disappointing. Was it week 16 to get there? Yeah. So that's an example, obviously, like by definition anecdotal, but you're an example of where this 3 quarterback idea worked, and it's less opportunity cost because quarterback matters more than in traditional best ball.
Yeah, and these later quarterbacks, the quarterback scoring is very binary. If you play, you have the ability to score points, and if you're not starting, you cannot score points. Wide receivers can score points on any number of routes. Obviously, you're more likely to score 10 to 15 points on 40 routes than 20 routes, but still possible for the 20, 25 route player to catch a touchdown or the Kadarius Toney to get 7.1 points before he gets benched. So at quarterback, having any players that are capable to start, Malik Willis also was starting in the fantasy playoffs. I don't think he eclipsed 5 points because he had like 3 pass attempts.
Starts, man. I remember this.
Yeah. If you were telling me which of my quarterbacks would have been starting to get it through the finals, I would have guessed Willis. Tannehill's out. He's supposed to run a lot, capable of scoring more than 4 fantasy points, you would have thought, but no. But again, just having multiple outs to strong enough quarterback play, because it's only 10 probably quarterbacks, maybe as few as 7 or 8 if injuries hit it down, of quarterbacks playing any given week towards the end of the year. So having as many of those on your team, again, that always will carry an opportunity cost of 1 fewer position player. But I think in this tournament, you want to deliberately attack quarterback this way.
That makes sense. And in the article, you note that you want to be building teams that are between the 50th and 85th percentile in terms of their quarterback strength, which is difficult to say exactly what that looks like until we get into the tournament. What I would note, I'm not Daniel, okay? I can't draft a team and go, this feels about 77th percentile quarterback strength. What I would say is Daniel's saying he wants to be above average and not 99th percentile. You're not trying to go in and attack quarterback as if it's the most important thing. You got to be the very strongest team of quarterback. In fact, you don't, it sounds like, want to be building teams that are, 90th, 95th percentile in quarterback strength. So there's a little bit of a balance to it, but on average, you want to be in the strong, not ultra elite quarterback bucket. Is that correct?
Yes. Given that quarterbacks have paths to failure and injuries, I want to try and account for a little of that by adding some insurance to my quarterback rooms. With 3 quarterbacks, that really helps. You doubt if you're making it through that you only have 1 quarterback at that point. So that adds enough insurance. You also, the later quarterbacks don't carry too high an opportunity cost unless the market drastically shifts. Bryce Young and Will Levis, JJ McCarthy, pretty confident that they will be starting games, but the market will probably be expecting few fantasy points. And when I know they're starting or reasonably expecting the player to start, I want to assume the market's overconfident in their efficiency prognostication.
I mean, Stroud was the example of this last year. Like, I was not in all that interested in Stroud in Dynasty, which I wish I had been, but I was more open to him in best ball, actually, because it's like, hey, he's going to start. Like, and we just don't know. What do we know? We know he's going to start. What do we?
Yes.
Are we less sure of how many points he's going to score? So, and in regular best ball, you could stack him pretty easily. In this, like, that's a pretty big win if you're getting, and I would say there's rookies too. It's not just Bryce Young, who's a very safe bet to start all 17 games this season, just like he was last season. But you also have some rookies that I think are very safe bets to start. Let's say maybe not every single game, but by like week 4, they're out there and they play the rest of the year.
Yeah. With Young last year, he actually was, I don't remember my portfolio on the back of my hand, but I believe I was relatively underweight Young because he was quarterback 1 going significantly ahead of CJ Stroud by a round or 2.
Mm-hmm.
But we were pretty confident that both were going early enough in the draft that they would start games.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, start almost every game during the year. And when the market is overconfident, which it tends to be in that efficiency, I will take the volume and just hope that the like 55-45 that's being played as a 70-30 or 80-20 goes my way.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the article, that just kind of like the FFPC playoff contest, if you guys are familiar with my stuff on that, like when I do ownership projections for that contest, and it's striking. The field tends to break sort of like, if we're looking at 60-40 percentages in terms of the way the projection breaks out, the field often splits that 80-20. And this tournament sounds like can be similar, where there's not that big a difference between Young and Stroud. We prefer Young, but they're both in good situations. They're both going to start every game their rookie year in the vast majority of outcomes. They're both not like super strong prospects from a fantasy perspective. So we probably shouldn't have a strong preference on that, but the market did have that preference toward Young.
Yeah, so anytime you have a similar tier of player, the cheapest one will probably be my preference with the rookie quarterbacks. Caleb has a really, really nice situation, but I would probably be partial to quarterbacks 2 and 3 in this, like Jaden and Drake May.
I think Caleb, well, I do think he's just like 100% to start every game in that.
Yeah.
And I don't think May is.
I would agree, but I think the market will overstate that difference. So when you cost adjust, I would be more overweight. I don't think I'd plan to be underweight Caleb in this format, given he's an extremely strong prospect, will start every game, and probably comes in cheap enough after.
Best Stroud weapons as well, it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Him and Stroud.
Sorry, yeah, I meant of the rookies. Well, let's get to the weapons discussion, because as good as Caleb Williams' weapons are, none of them are rookies or sophomores except Roschon Johnson, which is a fairly weak correlated play. And we don't have, in general, all that much correlation in this tournament. There's really 2 that as kind of the premier stacks, not surprises, CJ Stroud and Tank Dell, Anthony Richardson and Josh Downs. These are the 2 premier stacks in this tournament. You did note that, Jordan Addison to JJ McCarthy is certainly, a play you could make, but we don't know that that's actually going to come to fruition. Even if the Vikings, right, even if Crack Rock got us the skinny and they are coming up for JJ, like they still need someone to trade them that pick, and they need someone else not to outbid them to come up. So, and, I don't know if that skinny's correct or not. So it's hard to make, I mean, worst case scenario, you have Jordan Addison and JJ McCarthy and they're not correlated, and that could be fine. But
you're probably free rolling the McCarthy Addison correlation, but it's stronger than Caleb Williams, Roshan Johnson, even if McCarthy and Addison aren't guaranteed to be on the same team, because how often is Caleb's scoring points that also lead to Roshan points? But Stroud and Dell and then Richardson and Downs are pretty nice correlation pieces.
These are the two, yeah.
And anytime I have the quarterback, I would be deliberately looking to add the pass catcher. My guess
How deliberately?
With Dell, I feel like I would prefer Stroud and Dell to obviously Rashee Rice and maybe even a Marvin Harrison. I think that if you're in the 56-person final and CJ Stroud gives you the usable, you win the title because you have CJ Stroud, how much more likely is Tank Dell's score now to be good enough to contribute to a win versus an uncorrelated Marvin Harrison Jr.?
Given the limited player pool, it seems like pretty likely, right?
That would be my instinct, is that the market will at least not correlate them enough close to the optimal. So I want to be overweight the pairs. The Richardson Downs, I think, is slightly weaker, with Richardson deriving a lot of his production from rushing value. But I would be deliberately attacking that stack as well, under the same idea that the market is underutilizing it.
One thing to just underline
there
here.
There are some
go ahead.
With Bryce Young, you can look at any of the receivers expected.
Go ahead. I think I lost Daniel.
Did my internet go down, or is that you?
No, we're good.
Okay. So what was the last thing we heard?
We heard everything. So I think you were about to explain Bryce Young's correlation.
Yeah. Okay. So Bryce Young is on a team with currently 2 second-round picks. One could get traded for T. Higgins, but I think that's pretty unlikely, maybe 5 to 10% of the time. You can look at the receivers that are going in the early second round. And again, that's a very weak correlation, but weak correlations are better than zeros here. So any receivers that, grinding the mock scouts say are going there that are more scheme fit, not really the Deontay Johnson type that would be redundant in Carolina, are weak correlations, but there's not much correlation in this tournament and not really where the edge is.
I mean, you could go Mingo, but does that have any appeal to you?
Yeah, if I had Bryce Young and needed to take a dart throw wide receiver, I would take Jonathan Mingo over every other dart throw wide receiver, but I wouldn't ever take the correlated Mingo over any of the receivers that could go in the first round.
I think that's prudent. Yeah. I just wanted to underline here that this tournament is like Best Ball Mania in that we do need to prioritize late season production. So like, if, based on what we're talking about here, it sounds like if I've got, Bryce Young and then I'm looking for a quarterback to pair him with, I'm less likely to want to pair Bryce Young with Will Levis than I am with some of the other rookies. Like maybe even, a JJ McCarthy would become more appealing to me than Will Levis with Bryce Young, because Bryce Young's starting week 1, week 2, all the way. He's going to start every game. If there's any game that Bryce Young weren't to start, though, it would be at the very end of the season. Same with Will Levis. Will Levis is starting out of the gate. He could get benched. Probably not, but it's definitely possible. JJ McCarthy's the opposite, where if he's playing games, he's closing out the season, unless he's god awful, and then you kind of lose anyway if he's god awful. So I think you probably want to think through that, right? Like not taking on two guys who are at risk of getting benched, even if it's small risk, and trying to create quarterback rooms that are sort of tilted to late season upside, provided you have enough early. I mean, you wouldn't want to take like Bo Nix and JJ McCarthy and Michael Penix. That might not be enough points early on, but I think you get my general take here.
Yeah, Bryce and Levis would be the two that I would be less likely to pair, given that both could miss at the end of the year. And you mentioned McCarthy. You know, if McCarthy's bad, he gets benched and then you lose the bet. You only lose like JJ McCarthy bet. If you have 3 quarterbacks and McCarthy's your QB3, you're still very much live with 2 other quarterbacks. You know, I had Malik Willis. He gave 0 usable weeks, I believe, that year, even though he had multiple starting opportunities. So if you have enough quarterbacks, and again, you don't want to overdo it because there will be teams that didn't have to overdo it in this tournament because it's big enough. So you do have to think about those competing dynamics. But Young and Levis would be the 2 I would caution against pairing. McCarthy feels like he'll be undervalued, as are, I think, the collective quarterbacks. But if I were guessing, I think McCarthy will be a much stronger pick than Nix and Penix, because I think McCarthy could start week 1, probably almost certainly starting halfway through the year. And unless he is hurt or one of the worst rookies we've ever seen playing at the end of the year, whereas there are paths for Penix and Nix to not play really at all.
McCarthy strikes me as a potential, as a really strong pick in this potentially, because I think he's draftable in the big board. I think I've drafted him once, so it's not actually twice. I timed out one time and took him. But I've intentionally drafted McCarthy one time, but I do think he's like draftable in a pinch in the big board. But then you take that over to this player pool where there's just so many fewer options, and like McCarthy is the one who could bank the Vikings. I mean, if he's the Vikings quarterback, like, yeah, he's probably not starting over Sam Darnold week 1, I guess. Although
he could.
Yeah. And then it's like, man, he's actually like a pretty strong fit for that system, I think. And obviously you've got great weapons there, really quarterback friendly system. They pass a decent amount, so you're less worried about the low volume stuff. Like I think even in Denver, you could be looking at like a really run heavy offense with a rookie quarterback. So that's McCarthy, I think, is significantly more appealing. And then I would say Nix is next most appealing because he, I think, has a better chance to land in Denver, where he could start right away. So Nix is someone I definitely want to be mixing in. Penix is the guy. I'm not really buying him as a round 1 quarterback, and it sounds like you also think he probably goes round 2.
Yeah, I've seen this story before. I was fooled by Malik Willis. I was not fooled by Hendon Hooker. I think that Penix profiles pretty similarly to Hendon Hooker with a lot of the,
well, he's more of a pocket passer than, Hooker was more mobile, wasn't he?
Hyper productive late career player.
Okay.
Injury. Okay. Hooker, I guess, tore his ACL right before the rookie year, whereas Penix has already torn multiple ACLs, but seems to be recovered. This is not.
I think the medical stuff went pretty well, from what I understand.
Yeah. This is rarely a prospect that we see go in round 1. And initially, when we were building the leg up ranks, we were a bit hesitant on McCarthy. And I was the most skeptical. I said, I don't think this is a round 1 or at least early round 1 quarterback. Every report has been this is an early round 1 quarterback. The Vikings just acquired a second first-round pick. I would be downright shocked if they are not internally considering the move up, and I think likely to make that move up in the near future. So I would like to bet on McCarthy's outsized chance landing in Minnesota. But given that our baseline is we feel good that McCarthy's starting most of the year, I want to let the efficiency chips fall where they may and say because McCarthy's getting a shot on goal as a starter, he'll have enough of an opportunity to accumulate points, and the other rookie quarterbacks are probably drafted disproportionately too far ahead. Because if all 4 of the top 4 are starting, there's not too much of a weekly projection difference, especially if McCarthy's in Minnesota, which I think is probably, I don't like going over 50% on player to team fits outside of the beginning of the draft, but I think I'm close to 50, if not higher than 50, given that Minnesota just preemptively got a second first round pick. And if you can.
Yeah. I feel confident that Minnesota wants McCarthy, or they want a quarterback, and I think
they feel probably good with at least 4 of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think they probably like take May over McCarthy, but I don't think they'll have that opportunity. It seems like it's going to go quarterback, 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 Marvin Harrison, and then maybe they get in there or maybe they get in, maybe it goes 4 straight quarterbacks to start if they trade with the Cardinals. One thing, just on the quarterback thing, because as we talk through like Bo Nix should be pretty cheap, and he could literally be a 17-game starter for the Broncos. It's not. I don't know if I would say that's like the most likely outcome, but it's a realistic outcome. Even if he's not, he could start games at the end of the season. It's making me wonder if, like, man, even if I have Stroud, let's say I have Stroud young, I'm going to be tempted to add a Bo Nix, maybe even a Penix, certainly a McCarthy if he were to fall. Is that above that 85th percentile for you where you're like, I think I'm good with a Stroud young?
No, with Stroud Young, I'd be pretty happy with McCarthy. I think that would be in
Okay.
the 85th, but the 85th was more the cutoff to say, those like 95th to 100th percentile teams where, it's Stroud, Richardson, and then a third really strong quarterback. Don't try and do that. So
Okay.
just cautioning people away from the super high tail. So I would be happy. I'd be happy with McCarthy. You could easily justify Nix and Penix because they'll be towards the end of the draft.
Mm-hmm.
And Nix is a player I'll probably want to mix in, but I think McCarthy, if where we think he lines up in ADP is close enough to correct, I think he'll be a really strong pick.
I like that. Another part of the article that you get into here is sort of the tactics of drafting. And these are 4-team drafts. So you're either drafting from, the one hole. So you're going to be, the 3 or the 2-3 turn, etc. You're going to be on that turn. If you're at the 4 hole, you got the opposite turns, or you're in the middle. So you're kind of dictating a turn to one of the other 4 guys. So Daniel had to drop off, but if you're in one of, so you basically need to figure out, you're in one of 2 positions. You're either on a turn or you're dictating a turn. And so Daniel talks about just kind of understanding that dynamic, referencing an article that I wrote last year. I was talking about in 12-team drafts, the ADP actually set up so that you could dictate the 4-5 turn from like the 3 hole, the 4 hole. The simplest way to explain it is if you're out of the 102. But last year, let's say you're out of the 103 last year in a draft. It's set up so that you could actually be looking at a team out of the 1 hole who had already taken a quarterback, and then the 2 hole had Jamar Chase. And so the move was actually, if you wanted to get Justin Fields and DJ Moore as a stack, the move was to take DJ Moore, not Justin Fields. Because if you took Justin Fields, DJ Moore is an appealing wide receiver that would potentially get snapped up. You took DJ Moore, now the 1 hole doesn't have the opportunity to double stack and get, even if they already had like a Josh Allen, they might find it appealing to get a stacked, DJ Moore, Justin Fields. You take that possibility away from them, and they're like, I already have a quarterback. Why would I take unstacked Justin Fields? The Chase drafter is going to be like, well, I've got Burrow here. Why would I take unstacked Justin Fields when I can stack Burrow with Chase? So you kind of end up in a situation where you can kind of dictate that turn. Now, even if those teams did not have quarterbacks, rationally, the second that you take DJ Moore, they are disincentivized from taking Justin Fields. Would that work most of the time? Probably not. Probably not. You need those teams to be very rational, very focused on correlation in a way that we can't always count on. But there are dynamics like that in this draft, in these drafts, in this format, where if you're out of the 2 or the 3 spot, you can kind of dictate to the person out of the 1 or the 4 how that turn's going to go. What are like, it's a little different here, Daniel, because we're not generally talking so much about correlation. We're talking more about kind of positional stuff, right? And what are examples of kind of how you're able to dictate to the turn if you're out of the 2 or the 3 spot?
Yeah. So You hit it right on the nose. There's no real correlation element, but there is a lot of positional scarcity. For instance, if the 1-2 turn player has already taken 2 running backs, which I think will happen a good non-zero amount, and you're the 3 hole, then once you're picking really any time later in the draft, you should be passing on the running back because you know that some of the time you have a rational drafter, and you'll enough of the time lead them to pass on. They'll pass on running backs often enough for you to be better off. Say you like Chase Brown at the 3-4 turn or even the 5-6 turn, whichever turn it is, it doesn't really matter. You will have the opportunity to pass on the running back if the team on the turn is running back heavy. If a team has double tap quarterbacks, you will have the opportunity to pass on the quarterback at, say, the 503 and then take them at the 602. So there are mechanisms like that during the draft. Also,
And in that scenario, you're basically betting. You're saying, would you like to destroy yourself by doing something really kind of that hurts your build? Like you're now going to be really overweight on running back, and so if you get hurt by, a team's got Gibbs and Achan, and you're saying I would like to take a running back, but I'm going to push that running back to you, who you shouldn't take this running back. You're already too strong. If they do go ahead and take running back, that actually makes the team less of a threat. Same with quarterback. If you're sort of assessing that situation, so it hurts, it's a pain. You're like, my team's now worse, but their team's now worse too. And so there's kind of this like almost like playoff best ball where you're sort of saying like, if you stay in your lane, both of our teams will be stronger for it. And so you kind of want to you want to give them the chance to stay in their lane because then you and them benefit. But if they don't, then at least they're also hurt by that too, not just you.
yeah, you don't want to prematurely make a decision that can be made for you elsewhere. You want to be able to conserve the draft capital of that decision. And again, it's only 2 picks every time, but this is non-zero. And in a game, if you compound enough micro edges, you can eke out positive expected value. So doing that consistently will be good. Again, if you're doing these drafts multiple in a session, say you pencil in 1 hour and you do 4 to 5 drafts, there's a good chance you'll have a repeat person in a room. So if you note anyone's habits, you can then start using those. They'll probably do the same with you if they're rational enough. So there are a lot of elements like that. And you mentioned, yes, sometimes it will bite you. And the only times I would caution against being willing to push is if it's truly the last player in a tier. Quarterback, especially if you're, say, have one of Stroud or Richardson and you really want JJ McCarthy, because if it's not JJ McCarthy and you're just at Stroud and then a Bo Nix or Penix, you don't feel great, then you don't need to, put your cards on the table and say, I dare you to mess up, because sure enough, those players will mess up a lot. I've had those playoff best ball drafts where I tell them, yeah, go ahead and take naked Jared Goff when I'm building out my line stack to get me through. And then sure enough, they would love naked Jared Goff. There's nothing that the drafter signs want more. So there are a few occasions, if it's the end of a tier, because there's no correlation here. So it's really, if you see a tier break at running back, say Zach Charbonnet is the last plausibly good running back in your mind available, you then necessarily don't want to push him too much. Don't get overconfident in another player's rationality, but generally let the decisions be made by others when possible.
That's a really, really strong point. Yeah, I think when I said before, like, you want to give them the opportunity to kind of mess up their team, even if it would mess up your team. If it's going to like destroy your whole draft, I wouldn't give someone that opportunity. If they're going to make me take Marshawn Lloyd instead of Jalen Wright, I will give them that opportunity. I would rather have Wright. It's not the end of the world if I end up with Lloyd. My general draft plan hasn't changed. It's just a kind of, I got one running back I like slightly less than another. If it's actually changing out how I now have to play quarterback, I think you just take that quarterback, protect yourself. And you talk about in the article, you get into some discussion of risk tolerance and, understanding that there's a push-pull here where we can try to make sure that no drafts get wrecked. We can also play for super teams, which has in a small final, like, and a limited player pool, if you're able to combine these players in unique ways, that's pretty powerful. So you want to talk just a bit about like that push pull?
Yeah, early in the drafts, if you're getting strong ADP values, I'm far less considering structure. If it's the first 2 or 3 picks, I'll have 9 to 10 more to fill out a team that I think is structurally sound enough. But then once you get to the end of the draft, ADP value matters far less. Unless you really need that quarterback, or if you have, say, Stroud and Young and McCarthy, or even a Will Levis is falling a lot, then you should say, yeah, this is on the stronger end of quarterback, but I want to live some drafts on this really strong end, not on the 99th percentile, but 90th, 95th, whatever that may be. So you should be willing to do that in certain opportunities at the
Mix it
beginning
in,
of
yeah.
yeah. At the beginning of drafts, I'm really willing to try and form those super teams. There's really no structure within your first 4 picks that's been decided. So if you can get what you believe is a unique 4 combo, that is really nice.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to? So is it Goodhart's law? I didn't expect there was going to be some economic laws in this article, but there were.
Yeah.
What's Goodhart's law?
Okay, let's hope that pronunciation is correct. But essentially, it says
Goddard's? Is it Goddard?
it could be, but it's been just shrinking and condensed to say when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So in drafting sense, if you say I want 2 to 3 quarterbacks, 3 to 4 running backs, and 6 to 7 wide receivers in a draft, after the fact, if then you're looking at your portfolio, you're measuring your portfolio in terms of how many roster slots you allocated to each position. But if then you start going into draft saying I need 2 to 3 quarterbacks, 3 to 4 running backs, 6 to 7 wide receivers, unintended consequences will almost always force at higher frequency rates
Because you'll
suboptimal
draft
decisions.
suboptimally to check those
Real
boxes.
life, the UK did COVID testing where they said, "What? Sorry, I cut out."
No, I jumped in just to say the reason that happens is because you will start to draft suboptimally in order to check those boxes.
Yes, in practical terms, if it's easier to illustrate, the UK when they were doing COVID testing said our data looks good when we're getting enough information when 100,000 tests every day come in on people's COVID results. Then they eventually said, let's get 100,000 tests done every day. And that then led to some less than ideal results in their testing. So even if you might think, oh, why would this change? Once you start anchoring to previous measures as targets, unintended consequences often arise. And then another example for people who did a lot of playoff basketball, which I assume is a lot of this audience, if you had a running back room of Isaiah Pacheco, David Montgomery, and Elijah Mitchell, so you're playing a Chiefs Super Bowl against the Lions or the Niners, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire is there in the last round, you would probably still want to take him, even though conventional structural drafting would say that a 1.36 is better than a 1.45 because you're getting enough correlation and you want to have that level of fluidity at times.
Right. So what you're saying is in playoff best ball, it's like you probably want to be done at running back based on what you're typically building, but you've got this Chiefs build and your running back room's kind of weak. And so you should you should use the other things we know matter, like correlation, right? And you've already bet on this team to make the Super Bowl. And we know in playoff best ball, it's important to have running backs tied with the quarterback. And so it makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons that are important to understand in the format to have taken CEH there. You also mentioned that, if you're building out like a Bills 49ers Super Bowl and you have too many wide receivers, but you have the chance to tack on like a Jawan Jennings, that's probably the way to go as long as you were strong enough at running back. In the example you used, it's like, yes, you're light at running back, but you had James Cook and CMC. So in that scenario, it's like, well, I'll do 2 running backs rather than tacking on some random third running back to check that I have at least 3 running backs. I'm just going to go 2 and take the stronger pick in Jawan Jennings. I think you definitely want to be doing that here. Like, take the stronger pick, and then you want to have kind of in general what from a large portfolio review sort of mindset what good teams are generally going to be structured like. But good teams are going to be built using an understanding of the player pool and, correlation to the extent that we can get it. So with all that said, here are the guardrails that Daniel recommended in this. It's ideally rosters should have 2 to 3 possible starting quarterbacks with a top tier running back 1, at most 3 running backs, the mid tier running back 1, at most 4 running backs. And that's going to lead to 6 to 7 wide receivers / tight ends on most teams. That's, again, you don't want to go in and go, I have this at most 3 running backs, and I have a top tier running back 1, but it's a 6th round and Achan's here. What should I do? Take Achan, dude.
Yes. And again, if there ain't changes needed for this after we see ADP, they'll be adjusted in the article. But guardrails are just that. You don't want to be straying too far, but if an ADP value presents itself and say then it leaves you with only probably 6 wide receivers. I left the guardrails wide enough. Like I didn't say, oh, you need 7 wide receivers or you need 6. I think both are functional. You could probably go to 8 if needed. Say you get CJ or Anthony Richardson, and then you get 2 of the elite running backs and then another one of the rookie quarterbacks, so Caleb, Daniels, or May. You could probably justify then taking 8 late receivers. So those are situations where, the guardrails are there, but you also know there are some contextual adjustments that you made. So, trust yourself.
For sure. We should probably wind down. I will note in the article, which everyone should go check out on Legendary Upside. We'll have a link to the article in the description as well. There's some additional discussion of tight end. And in short, tight end is less valuable here than in traditional best ball because it doesn't have its own position. That's pretty simple. But Daniel kind of jumps into some examples in the article of specific tight ends, how he would kind of weight that.
Yeah, and because tight ends and wide receivers are together, the market probably factors that in to some extent to give them credit, maybe half as much to even 80% as much as they should. But until that number is 100%, you'd rather be taking tight ends in the tournaments where they are less disadvantaged. So in this case, it would be the big board than post-draft contests. So my gut instinct is to believe the market will undervalue tight ends enough to where I'd like general fade positions on the cohort.
Yeah, and I think also like at Legendary Upside, we're generally into the elite tight ends. Laporta is going a little higher than I like, so we don't necessarily have a ton of Laporta, and he is the sophomore here. So maybe this isn't entirely true, but if Laporta were to fall a little, we would probably have a fair amount, and that may happen in Best Ball Mania. So this isn't, I guess, like in general, the rookies and sophomores can be a spot where Legendary Upside for once is not as high on the elite tight end options.
Yeah, and then I'd also want to add Jonathan Brooks is a player that we're generally high on because we like his prospects of during weeks 15, 16, 17 taking on the workload. But in the big board, weeks 15, 16, 17 are more important than they are here relative to the regular season weeks. Because
why is that?
If you're only taking probably 3 to 4 running backs, you are then demanding Jonathan Brooks. Jonathan Brooks' absent scores early in the year are more penal than they would be otherwise because you'll have the opportunities to mitigate it. Here a mitigation would be a Zach Charbonnet or Roshan Johnson, whereas you can get early season projectable touches from the veterans that we aren't as
Singletary, Gus Edwards, Chuba Hubbard. I mean, cheap. You can do it cheap.
Yeah. So that would be a player where if you're looking at all your contests in a single portfolio as best as you can, Jonathan Brooks is a meaningfully worse pick here than he would be in other tournaments. But that doesn't mean have zero. Any player can win this either from having enough strong weeks or being the key leverage piece, which is why I don't really want to take anyone to 0, anyone to 50.
Anyone to 50? What do you mean?
So the base exposure would be 25% because 4 teams. So I don't want to be more than double the field often on anyone. I don't want to have 0 of anyone.
So, I mean, double the field, though, like in Best Ball Mania, would be 16%. And we regularly go above 60. I mean, I regularly go above 16% on guys, maybe even too much. Why would obviously 50 is a much higher number than 16, but is there any other reason that you wouldn't want to double the field here?
With how important leverage can be in the final here, I don't. And again, if players are leveraged, they have probably been disappointing in the past. So you
Right.
don't want a team full of the bad players. But if you have all of the, highest performing players recently, it'll be likely that 30 to 40 of the other lineups have a lot of the same people. And then your path to first is different. So I like to mix that. And I'm also pretty closer to exposure. Like you say, you regularly go over double. I don't do it as often. So that's more a rule for me. And again, that's about a user weighing their risk tolerance. So everyone's different, to each their own.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like, going 75% to the 3x the field, where again, like that's something that's more of like what I would see as like a stand. Like if I had a 24%, you know, exposure to a player, I would view that as a stand. And, I would, but I have gone to like, now you literally, I mean, part of it is that if you go 4x the field, that's 100% in this tournament. And that would only be 32% in best ball mini or the big board. So I think that's like part of it is just like harder to be that much higher than the field. But it sounds like the leverage element, in addition to the risk tolerance, the leverage opportunity cost, in a sense, of drafting a disappointing player who then turns it on in week 15, 16, or 17. Like you want to have those bets mixed up a little bit, because so much will come down not to like not hitting on the guy you need, but instead hitting on a guy you didn't need until that 1 week where you did.
Yeah. And quarterback is a position where if you think Bo Nix is materially more likely to be the Broncos quarterback, then I completely understand going in on him and just going with that assumption. If you think any of the rookie wide receivers, you either really like their profile, want to root for them, or think they'll get good enough draft capital better than the market's indicating, yeah, go ahead and push exposure to 50, 60%. And at the end of drafts, the opportunity cost is lower. But if you're at the beginning of drafts, saying, I want 50 to 60% of Stroud or Richardson, well, that has to come from only like 1 to 3 other players. So
Right.
being really overweight on one player causes you to be severely underweight on other strong bets.
Like pretty strong bets. I would say that I am not, and maybe this wouldn't always be the case, but there are not players who I assume will go high in this tournament that I'm like, man, how can you take that guy? These are all, I mean, I guess they're all just young players who I'm excited about, but it's, like I think Achan is a good pick, even though, he's not going to be like a true workhorse back. Gibbs, Bijan, like very, very strong picks. So if you were to just make a giant stand on Anthony Richardson or something, there's big opportunity costs there. I think that's a really important point.
The big stand on Anthony Richardson, if you're 16 to 20%, that's coming from like 2 to 3% across a lot of players. Here, there is not that ability to spread out small pieces of other people. It would be much bigger pieces of a few players.
Right. Yeah. It's directly leading to fades on guys I assume also like. The last point on the exposure part, the at the end of the draft, you probably want to mix up those bets, right? Because if you have 10% of Javon Baker, that's probably going to be significantly overweight the field, given that there's not that many rounds in this tournament, right?
Yeah, that all depends on your risk tolerance and your confidence. I tend to want to be as humble as I can with those late round bets, unless I think the draft capital is being meaningfully misprojected. But very few people are taking a lot of those dart throws. So if you want to just regularly mix in any of the players from the like dart throw tier into the tier above, yeah, that's fine. But I wouldn't want 50% of any of those players unless I had a really good evidence-based reason.
Yeah, because I mean, like, and some of these guys are interesting. Jamari Thrash, Johnny Wilson, right? These guys, like, I'll mix in occasionally to builds in best or in the big board. But if you get to like 30% Johnny Wilson, that's almost like, I mean, is it like 60% of going on someone else or even higher? Because a lot of people just aren't drafting Johnny Wilson.
Yeah, it seems needlessly excessive.
Yeah.
If you want to just have a lot of your portfolio live and die. As much as a portfolio can live and die by a 12th round pick, you can make that decision. But do you think that I think it's unlikely the market will ever miss something to such an extent that would justify it. So that's why I would like to mix them. If there's any correlation element, I would add that. But in a tournament with very low correlation, it's, almost a dart throw at the end, in my opinion.
I agree. All right. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks so much, Daniel, for jumping on, talking through this article. Highly, highly recommend checking out the article. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube. Really helps us out here. And yeah, we'll see you next time. I'm going to be talking with Rotopat later in the week, talking about some of the free agency landing spots. So that'll be a fun one. See you then.